for Global Education at Results Educational Fund, based in Washington, D.C. Also with the Global Partnership for shortly.
Hi, I'm Margaret, Irving. I lead up the team on planning, systems and finance at the Global Partnership for Education, which is also DC based. My focus areas are very much kind of hard parts of education in the sense that they're less focused on the kind of well, my focus is more on data, collecting data on domestic finance for education, and like I said, planning and policy making.
Hi, my name is Suguru, Mizonoya. I work for UNICEF in New York, and I'm working in the data and analytics section, and I'm in charge of education, data, and research.
Okay, thank you so much. So just to make up on the time, I'm not going to say anything else, and we'll just go straight to the presenters. So we're going to start with Margaret, and then Tony will take over, and then finally Suguru will have. And then what we'll do is once they've presented, we'll have our Q&A, and everyone can ask questions, and I'll just help moderate that.
Great. So I'm aware. I'm sure some folks in the room might be familiar with GPE, the Global Partnership for Education, but others might not be. So just by way of introduction. The Global Partnership for Education is literally a partnership formed in the early 2000s to help to try and accelerate movement towards initially the MDGs. It's a large grant-making organization. Currently, we disperse around $500 million a year to developing countries directly. But I think one of the really unique aspects of GPE is that it's literally a partnership. So I work at the Secretariat, we have a board which Tony is part, or representative part. We have developing countries, we have donors, we have civil society organizations, all represented on the board and all helping to guide the strategic direction of GPE. We currently work in 65 countries, and the countries that we work in are determined on a needs basis. So there are countries where either income is very low or educational attainment is very, very poor. And that's kind of how we determine our what we call DCPs, developing country partners. So GPE a couple of years back, I guess 2 years or so ago, developed what we call our Strategy 2020, which is kind of the guiding framework for the next few years of what GPE hopes to achieve. And one of the key principles outlined at the very start of the GPE Strategy 2020 is that the organization views education as a public good, a human right, and an enabler of other rights. Like I say, we really are focused on ensuring equitable and quality education. But one of the key mechanisms through which we do that is through strengthening sector planning. And I guess my kind of take here is to say, in order to promote kind of human rights in education, we have to really plan for it. And this, I think, is particularly relevant in the broader context of the conference theme of uncertainty. So I'm going to speak a little to what GPE does to assist and support and encourage good planning and focus on marginalized groups and on situations of fragility and conflict. I guess I did want to say from the outset, I think the title's been changed a little bit. I recognize that the kind of focus on planning is inherently much more instrumental than is a pure kind of human rights-based approach to education. But I guess I would add the qualifier that kind of it does, GPE's perspective would be that education is an enabler for achieving many important objectives, less vulnerability in the labor market, better healthcare decisions, more informed global citizens, basically expanding individuals' range of options, even though I guess our model would fit closer into kind of a human capital model of education. So, like I say, one of our key focuses is to kind of leverage our funding model for better sector planning. And we do this in a couple of different ways. First of all, one of the key grant mechanisms that we provide is, or one of the key grants that we provide is specifically to help countries develop good education sector plans. By good, I mean there are two elements that I think that are relevant here. One is that we consider education sector plans should focus, or have at least some focus on marginalized groups. GPE's particular thematic areas to focus on individuals with disability. We have a very strong gender focus, and we also have strong support for countries experiencing fragility and crisis. So many of those countries are dealing with issues to do with refugees, internally displaced people, and so forth. So we try to ensure that the sector plan as a whole is kind of gives due recognition to those marginalized groups. Another thing that we think is really important in the planning process is that in order to achieve buy-in, in order to ensure that a plan, an education sector plan, is truly representative of what a society wants and needs, we encourage the countries to make really, or to build on really participatory processes. So GPE encourages the development. Every country is a little different, but we call it the local education group, which is effectively a kind of collaborative stakeholder group. So we encourage individuals to kind of get from across society, so from the national government, donors, private sector, civil society, the philanthropies, and we believe that all individuals should contribute to the kind of planning process. And so one of our grant-making mechanisms is to try to build these good, strong sector plans, using strong evidence, which I guess is another area we could go into a lot of detail on, the absence of data, particularly on marginalized groups. But in addition to that, probably the biggest part of our grant making is through program implementation grants, which are not just planning grants, but grants that actually enable kind of the implementation of particular parts of the sector plan. And GPE leaves it at the country discretion as to which particular part of the sector plan countries want to use the money to fund. But I guess what I see as being really valuable about the way our funding model works is that we use the grant money as kind of a lever to ensure that there are robust planning foundations in place. So for example, in order to qualify for a grant, a country either has to demonstrate that it has achieved universal primary education, or it's channeling a large amount of money into primary education. Before it can apply for a program grant, which are the much larger grants, it has to demonstrate that the education sector plan it has developed is what we call credible. So, contains all of those elements that I've described. So it's participatory, it is it has a focus on marginalized groups, it tries to build on whatever evidence exists in the country. And so, because those are these kinds of prerequisites for receiving the funding, they help to act as a lever for actually achieving better planning processes. Again, even the process of deciding what should be funded by the grant, GPE encourages a participatory process. So again, trying to draw on stakeholders from across the country or across the different groups within the country to be able to address the particular needs of the most kind of pressing needs identified in the education sector plan. I guess the other thing that we also see as very important is there was kind of a piece that maybe ties into what Suguru and perhaps Tony were talking about a little, is the idea that, at some point there was a kind of realization that we were focusing a lot, we as an organization were focusing a lot on developing this plan, this one-off document which would cover kind of anywhere from 5 to 10 years. But there wasn't very good monitoring and follow-up of the plan, and there wasn't always necessarily kind of a flexibility and adaptability into that plan. So again, I guess this ties in more with the theme of uncertainty, but more and more GPE is moving towards also being able to support and reinforce kind of review mechanisms, in particular through what are called joint sector reviews, again, bringing in multiple stakeholders to kind of annually review the plan and develop, like both act as kind of a monitoring accountability mechanism, mutual accountability being one of the core principles of GPE's model, but not only facilitating kind of better monitoring and accountability, but also allowing for flexible and adaptive planning as kind of situations change. Stakeholders are able to bring evidence to the table to suggest how the plan itself should change. We are also opening up a new funding window called the Knowledge and Innovation Exchange, which is going to allow us to deal with a wide range of thematic areas, from gender to better data to better teaching and learning. I'll be talking a little bit tomorrow, I believe, in plenary, so I'm going to kind of hold off on that piece for now. It's kind of a very broad overview. I'm happy to answer questions, but I think we're going to hand over to Tony.
Thank you so much, Margaret. I really appreciate that. I think you said participatory around 5 times. But I counted, and I think that's so crucial to how we develop our plans and policies in terms of making sure that all stakeholders really own this education plan. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you, Aqeela. Thank you, Margaret. Yeah, I'll build on what Margaret has begun to lay out and adding on a bit of a civil society perspective on these processes. But I suppose to start with human rights, where to begin? The origins of human rights go back millennia. Most societies have had some form of the golden rule of do unto others as you would have them do unto you. The Hindu Vedas, the Code of Hammurabi, the Quran, the Bible, humanity's oldest written sources deal with the issues of duties, responsibilities, and rights. And then more recently, after the horrors of World War II, the nations of the world came together and unanimously adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. In 1966, these were further enshrined into 2 treaties, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And currently, almost all countries around the world, 166 of them, have ratified the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Among other things, the covenant obligates governments to provide free primary education and progressively free higher education. But as we're all acutely aware, I believe, 50 years later, these basic obligations have not been met in most countries. Looking at the most recent data from UNESCO, again, that I think we're all familiar with, 1 out of every 10 child is not in primary or lower secondary school in half of those countries. When we look at available completion data, the lack of the right to education spreads, with 89 countries having 1 in 10 children not completing primary or lower secondary school. And of course, we well know that learning outcomes are dismally low in many schools in the world's poorest countries and beyond as well. So our perspective is that we cannot wait any longer to fulfill fundamental human rights. At Results Educational Fund, we and our partners have launched a new initiative to close the gap between policy and practice. The Right to Education Index, as we've called it, is a global accountability initiative designed to monitor national progress towards the right to education, working with governments, civil society, and others to accelerate it. And I'll be keen to note that RTEI is not a top-down desk review index. It is a capacity-building, research to advocacy program. But with its origins, we set out and really built on the years of work by the London-based Right to Education Project, which worked with human rights experts and academics to develop a very large bank of indicators on the right to education. We've taken the 32 legally binding treaties and conventions that deal with the right to education, extrapolated 79 indicators related to government obligations, and put them into a questionnaire, a very large questionnaire that I think some of us around the room are familiar with as well. The questionnaire is completed by in-country civil society using national data, peer-reviewed by national research institutions and made available for government review. And then final results are used in reports and advocacy materials, which are used to support in-country advocacy campaigns on the right to education. And the project really operates on this type of 2-year project cycle, with the first year being research and data collection to complete the questionnaire, and the second year seeing support to a subset of those partners to develop and implement in-country advocacy strategies based on their findings. Ultimately, all of this forms a platform of partnership and support to coordinated advocacy efforts to realize the right to education. And just a quick note, we're also acutely aware of the limitations and risks of such an index. The complexities of the right to education can never be fully measured and compared. Over the years, we've built a robust methodology while knowing that it is a work in progress that will continue to improve in the years ahead, particularly as the data itself becomes more available and more comparable. But meanwhile, we are rather impatient to harness the advocacy potential that demand-driven participatory indices have to offer. There is something about a number or a ranking or a comparison with neighboring countries that make governments sit up and ask, what is this and how is this calculated and how can we do better? And as is what seems to be the modern mantra and central to discussions, I think, in these next 2 days, if it doesn't get measured, it doesn't get monitored, and we simply must make greater progress towards the right to education. We piloted RTI in 5 countries in 2015 and ran the first official round in 15 countries in 2016. In 2017, we had the first year for RTI advocacy, where we worked with national education coalitions and civil society partners in Honduras, Palestine, Zimbabwe, Tanzania, and Indonesia on issues like school reentry for pregnant girls and young mothers in Tanzania, alternative discipline policies to end corporal punishment in Zimbabwe, rights-based budgeting for SDG 4 in Palestine, and teacher training on inclusive education in Indonesia. RTI collaborates closely with the Global Campaign for Education, which many of you may be familiar with. That is the global network of national education coalitions in more than 100 countries around the world. These are the civil society groups who are increasingly having a seat at the national policy-making table that we heard about earlier with GPE and what we call the local education groups. And what we find is RTI is helping these groups strengthen their inputs in these policy processes and really changing the dialogue from one of general civil society needs and demands to one of how to meet clear government obligations to the right to education as stipulated by treaties and conventions that they've signed on to. So, for example, school fees as established by Zimbabwe's Education Act and its education sector plan are not only detrimental to the poor, but as found by the Education Coalition of Zimbabwe, are in contravention to the international and regional conventions that the government of Zimbabwe has ratified. In Honduras, for Dakar, the National Education Coalition there, taking its name from the Education for All goals that were established in Dakar in 2000, found that enrollment of children with disabilities is increasing, but that 2/3 of the schools are not pedagogically equipped to meet their needs. And for Dakar worked with teachers, civil society, the National Board of Education, and the technicians of Honduras's new education sector plan to address this situation. I won't go into all of the examples. I have a few reports around the table there if anyone is interested. This year we're currently in our next data collection phase, scaled up to 20 countries, and we're already very excited about the in-country advocacy campaigns that we anticipate supporting next year. Now, beyond this, I'm compelled to acknowledge what seems to be a new point in time with what we seem to be finding ourselves with civil society. Mobilization and coordination really seems higher than ever. Global north-south silos are being broken down to form singular collective action, and that is really what is needed to get the job done at a combined national, regional, and global level. If you've looked into the field of social accountability, you may be familiar with the need for level-up accountability. While national civil society is gaining increased access to policy spaces, there are still challenges with meaningful response from governments and others to civil society input. Without an external eye beyond their borders, there may be little incentive for governments to do much more. And what seems to be needed is this type of next level up accountability, and for those issues to be seen, mobilized, and acted on at the regional and global levels in partnership with civil society across all strands of that work. And I'll also say that in my work across global and north and south civil society, we are doing this all the time in a constant honing of this practice. To the point that other stakeholder groups are coming to us, like developing country partners themselves, who similarly are seeing the need to coordinate with one another, to have their voices heard and needs met in these various global platforms. They are now coming to us, having seen the impact of this type of mobilization and coordination, and wanting to learn how we do what we do and how they can achieve the same. And it's really this type of mobilization and coordination across all of these levels of governance that will be required to get the job done on many of the issues that we care about. Coming back to human rights, after millennia of articulating our duties and responsibilities to one another, some of these rights are getting closer within reach. We all are familiar with the obstacles in front of us, but I do believe that we're at an exciting time in history with the right institutions, platforms, and partnerships in place to really begin moving the needle on the right to education and accelerating progress towards it through this type of collective action. In closing, and as I think of the school's 2030 initiative and how today's children will progress through education over the coming years, today happens to be my 37th birthday.
Happy birthday.
Thank you. I am a small town boy from rural southeast Missouri, and I know that my life is just a complete product of my family, the passionate and committed teachers from my hometown public school, and the communities that I lived with for years in Tanzania. And I do have to say, to be at Oxford speaking on human rights and education policy is honestly an unimaginable dream come true. So really, thank you so much to the organizers for such an unwitting birthday present, and really to all of you for engaging in this critical and, as we know, really life-shaping discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tony. Thank you for choosing to spend your birthday. And thank you for talking so much about how data can be used to include civil society. I think that was quite insightful. Suguru, are you ready? Do you want to take the PowerPoint? Or?
No, actually, I wanted to use PowerPoint, but I have an issue with actually internet access.
Okay.
So maybe I will just go through.
Sure.
what I prepared.
Okay, sorry about that.
Thank you very much for both speakers, and maybe I will start on the note that Tony made around the importance of monitoring human rights, and I'd like to start with my own experience. In 2011, March 11th, I was in Kenya. I was working for UNICEF, and I received a phone call. I was in a meeting, and it was a call from somebody I don't know. It was unknown. You can see who is calling, right? It was unknown, so I just turned it off. And then there was a second one, and turned it off. And the third one, I felt something is wrong because they know that I don't want to talk to you. I don't know why is this, and so I just decided to take the phone, and it was from my wife in Japan, and she went back to Japan to deliver my first son, and he was delivered about 4 months ago. So she was in Japan until the time the child baby gets old enough to come to Kenya. And my wife told me that there was a huge earthquake and tsunami, and my house happened to be in an area which is very close to the Pacific Ocean, and also northern part of Japan, and also very close to the nuclear power plant. Mm-hmm. So kind of the best combination you can imagine. And so that was a shocking morning, and I tried to went back to Japan and to rescue my family first, and then I later joined UNICEF emergency response in Japan to support people in the northern east coast. Then I was working in the northern part, but I wanted to do something for my own province as well. But there was a huge risk of the high level of exposure to nuclear radioactivity. So not many NGOs were willing to go, or even the government were not taking very strong actions. But we tried to do something. So we went down and we had some interviews. One of the shocking moments I had was that the city governor announced that they were going to use locally produced agriculture and fishery products. They try to support farmers. They try to encourage the local businesses. So the mayor made that announcement. But the consequence of that is that the school meals were going to use locally produced agriculture product, and that was only after like 3 weeks of the nuclear explosion. And now we have much better system, and the level of the nuclear contamination is low. So now it's a doable policy option, but at that time it was not possible. But somehow it was very difficult for local stakeholders to push it back. My brother was a teacher, and my sister-in-law was also a teacher. So from the stories I heard, all the stakeholders were against. Of course, you don't want to expose your child and students to nuclear contamination. But it was very difficult. And back in Kenya, in many workers in the field of education tend to like kind of the phrases that we want to support the voiceless, the voice of children have to be heard. And that moment, back in Fukushima, I learned, okay, it's the voiceless is everywhere, not just in Africa, not just in developing countries, that's everywhere. And why are we having this program? Why children's voice are not heard? So that was a moment that realized me that I'm dealing with the children issue. I'm not dealing with development issue in developing countries. So one of the reasons why we have the weak participation in Japan in education, or probably other sectors, is that the participation rights of children is not monitored. Governments are accountable for the result. If there is a framework to monitor the result, you care. So there are different ways to unpack what it means by the rights to education, what it means by the different rights of children. There is a political process because you cannot really define what is the right, but it's possible to agree on certain major components of it. And then government should be available to explain for us what they have been doing, how they are allocating money, and then what are the results, and what kind of mechanisms are in place to make sure that children's rights are protected. But we don't have that. Instead, we have different kind of result frameworks. The number of children in school, enrollment rate, academic performances. They are very important. But because we spend so much time on the results, that are measurable, that is fine. And the results which are related to your programs, whatever it is, it can be our policy programs or the programs supported by donors. But since the results are connected to such programmable government activities, we tend to forget about the important monitoring of important education outcomes. After I left Kenya, I had a chance to go to Myanmar to study the education reform in Myanmar. And then we learned we were trying to align the monitoring framework of Myanmar education sector to SDG 4 targets. SDG 4 targets are the education targets globally agreed. So we wanted to see how they are aligned. And there are different. I don't want to go into details of the SDG because so many targets, so many indicators. But there are 11 targets, and one of them is called 4.7. And 4.7 is about global citizenship, education for sustainable development, human rights, peace, education. These kind of skills and knowledge actually treasure a lot in education society. But the funny thing is that when you talk with education colleagues about 4.7, somebody love it and other people reject it somehow because this is not measurable, this is too soft. So when I was given a task to align the Myanmar target, Myanmar education sector targets to SDG 4, I thought SDG 4.7 won't be a target that they would like. But I was wrong. By studying the basic education law, according to the new constitution they have, the very fundamental reasons why the Myanmar has education sector is to provide education for children so that children would be respecting others. They have 21st century skills, higher order thinking. They will be active citizens. So all sort of values that we treasure. That's the fundamental reasons why the Myanmar has the education sector. But when we look at the education sector monitoring plan, it's not part of it. So there is a huge misalignment issue of the target of education sectors around the world and what we are actually measuring. And in the case of developing countries, we do have a process to develop education sector plan, and there is a monitoring framework. But the monitoring framework of the sector plan is a monitoring framework of big program that is not equal to monitoring education rights. That there is a gap. And then when it comes to the international monitoring mechanisms of the education rights, maybe the most famous one for UNICEF at least is the Convention of the Rights of the Child. So that's the most popular convention in the world. More than 180 countries ratified. But what about the reporting? Member countries report every 5 years. And do they take it seriously? I question that. So are we measuring what we treasure? And all the important conversation we have today, we are talking about very important results or outcomes of education, what education should be providing for children in the future. But if we are not monitoring, if we are not putting government in the seat to provide us all the information about what they are providing, we will not get too far because there is no accountability mechanism. So it's very important to have a proper monitoring framework, making sure government is accountable and also create some kind of indicators that the people can use. Your parents can use, teachers can use, the society use. Everybody likes ranking, everybody likes the simplified information. It might not be very accurate. Like when you look at the FIFA World Cup, the number one country wants they win the championship all the time, right? So there are some kind of issues, but at least you know which soccer teams are strong by looking at the FIFA World Cup, the soccer ranking, right? So maybe it's not very accurate, but still we can have a very good idea. So once we have that tool to assess the government's efforts, and that tools and information is available for different participants or stakeholders in the education sector, we are aligning ourselves for the target will all be very important. So with that, I'd like to finish. And so maybe I will leave, I will end with just one question. So this question of uncertainty from the viewpoint of the monitoring framework. And the question I would like to ask, or I'd like to know the answer, is how we could develop a global monitoring mechanism in which the government are accountable, and civil society and parents and students and teachers have information and being able to get engaged to change education discourses for better results. So that's how I would link my argument around the education monitoring framework and also the uncertainty discussions we have today and tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you so much. What an amazing question to end with. And how do we measure and ensure that the data, as Tony said, is being fed back to parents and civil society to influence the education discourse? Thank you for being flexible and adaptable, and because you didn't have the PowerPoint, you still managed. Thank you so much. And can we just end with a round of applause for our three speakers? So the floor is now open